Tom Marvolo Riddle was born on a cold New Year's Eve in 1926 in a small orphanage in London, where his mother had died and his father had abandoned her without hesitation or farewell, as if he had cast away a forgotten possession. From infancy, he sensed a silent but profound gulf between himself and the other children around him, a feeling not born of arrogance, but of clarity, a recognition that he did not belong among them and never would. While others clung to ragged blankets and imaginary hopes, Tom watched in silence under flickering candlelight, teaching himself that need was weakness and attachment a chain. He discovered he could will flames to dance and locks to click open in the echoing hallways of the orphanage, where the walls peeled with age and whispers lingered in the air like dust motes in the light. His dark eyes, set deep in a pale, angular face, watched the cruel matron Mrs. Cole as she railed at disappointed visitors, her voice sharp and shrill, slicing through the stale air with the precision of a scalpel. He saw how the smallest cruelty could ripple like a stone cast in water, and he remembered it. The nights were long and cold and filled with restless dreams and fragmented memories that never belonged to him. Ancient stone corridors, a grand manor shrouded in fog, a name spoken in a language he had never heard but somehow understood. By his 6th birthday, Tom was already tall for his age and unnaturally composed, with a stillness that unsettled the others when he quietly ate his meager porridge or arranged his few possessions beneath his narrow cot with methodical care. He never cried, not once, not even in infancy, for he knew nothing of the mother who bore him or the father who abandoned him, and therefore felt no grief. Instead, he filled the empty hours by sitting in the darkest corner of the dormitory, tracing the worn runes etched into a chipped windowsill, memorizing their shapes with a reverence that bordered on obsession, convinced they carried secrets meant only for him. These markings were the first signs of something greater, something ancient and patient, waiting for him to notice and understand. When the snowy owl arrived, its feathers pristine against the soot-streaked sky, bearing a letter inscribed in elegant green script, it felt not like surprise, but confirmation. He read the words, "Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry by the pale light of dawn," and for a moment, a warmth unfamiliar and fierce bloomed in his chest, as if a frozen place within him had begun to thaw. He did not show it, but folded the letter with meticulous precision and hid it beneath his pillow. The parchment, delicate and significant, a fragile key to a world he had only glimpsed in restless dreams and instinctive longings. At breakfast the next morning, he barely registered the matron's harsh voice or her endless scolding about his manners, his chores, his unnatural silences. He was already far away in his mind, walking marble halls and speaking incantations, shaping reality with a word. The letter had revealed more than a school. It had shown him purpose, destiny, perhaps even identity. When he stood on platform 9 3/4, weeks later, surrounded by bustle and steam, beneath a gray glass domed concourse, the sight of the scarlet train roaring with energy filled him not with awe, but with clarity. This was where he was meant to be, not among the unknowing masses, but among the extraordinary, the powerful, the chosen. The wind tugged at his hair as he stepped aboard, and for the first time in his life, he felt the whisper of belonging not to people, but to legacy, to power, to the secret undercurrent that had always pulsed within him unacknowledged. The door closed behind him with a soft metallic thud, and he did not look back, not at the station, not at the world he left behind, not at the life that had never been his. He sat by the window as the train began to move, watching the blur of London fade into fields and forests. His mind silent, but his senses sharpened, every sound, every vibration registering like signals from a future he could not yet name. The boy across the aisle chatted with nervous excitement, but Tom ignored him, his gaze fixed on the passing world, his thoughts curling inward. He thought of the way Mrs. Cole had looked at the owl, the letter, the way her mouth had twitched with something like fear, and he realized that he liked that feeling, the power of knowing something others did not, the authority of knowledge unspoken. Already he began crafting who he would become, not Tom the orphan, but Tom the scholar, the prodigy, perhaps even Tom the great. He would not stumble blindly into this new world. He would master it, consume it, rise through it, and become the figure others whispered about in the dark. Even then, his ambition was a slow-burning fire, not yet rage but hunger, and he fed it with every image he could conjure of marble staircases, secret dungeons, libraries filled with dust and silence and power, waiting only for him to unlock it. At Hogwarts, Tom Riddle was placed in Slytherin House, as the Sorting Hat barely hesitated before announcing its choice. The hat had sensed in Tom a potent blend of ambition, cunning, and inner discipline, the qualities Salazar Slytherin had valued above all else. From the beginning, the castle seemed to speak to him, its torch-lit corridors dripping gargoyles, and ever-shifting staircases forming a labyrinth that called to something buried deep within him. He walked those halls like a boy in a dream, but it was not awe that filled him. It was recognition, the feeling of returning to a place he had never been yet always known. His professors saw his brilliance early on in Transfiguration under the stern guidance of Professor McGonagall. He turned silver goblets to solid stone and learned to alter their properties with surgical precision in charms. Professor Flitwick praised his subtle wand work, and in potions, the bubbling cauldrons under Professor Slughorn's supervision produced perfect results each time, meticulous and efficient. Tom never acted out, never broke rules without purpose. Instead, he studied the school, its people, its legends, its weaknesses and strengths. When others played outside, he sat in the castle library, buried deep in the restricted section, whispering over dusty tomes bound in cracked leather. His hunger for knowledge had little to do with grades and everything to do with power. He learned early about soul magic, about rituals long forgotten. He uncovered the concept of the Horcrux, a method by which a soul could be fractured and stored in objects, ensuring immortality at a cost. He did not shrink from that price. Instead, he sought to understand it fully, methodically. Each night, he practiced spells beyond the curriculum, in unused classrooms, coaxing candles to flicker without flame, commanding objects to move without touch, bending the will of physical things, as he would later bend people to his desires in one forgotten corner of the library. Behind a locked case, he found an old diary, empty at first, but alive when touched. The pages seemed to breathe beneath its fingers, and he saw memories unfold, not his own, but left there by someone who had walked these halls before him. He followed the clues to the myth of the Chamber of Secrets and the ancient legend of Salazar Slytherin's hidden monster. He pieced together fragments of Latin and Parseltongue and whispered them into darkness until something answered deep beneath the school. A colossal serpent coiled and sleeping waited for a voice it would obey. Tom had found it, and in doing so found himself. The thrill he felt was not fear, but exhilaration. He could command a beast born of bloodline and legend, and in secluded courtyards he practiced his parcel tongue until it rolled off his tongue like a second language, natural, inevitable. The years passed, and with them grew Tom's power. Though he wore the face of charm and grace, his smile masked calculation, and his compliments hid manipulation. He joined school clubs, played the role of the model student, and rose to prominence among his peers. He gave speeches with perfect clarity, acted in small school productions, and led debates with quiet authority. The professors praised him, the students respected him, but none of them saw what lay beneath. By his final year, Tom had mastered not only spells but suggestion, influencing those around him with carefully chosen words and subtle looks, bending their behavior without their awareness. When he finally opened the Chamber of Secrets and unleashed the basilisk, he did so, not with recklessness, but with quiet confidence. The creature killed a student, and Tom let the event fade into legend, closing the chamber once more and erasing his trail. The whispers about the heir of Slytherin began, and Tom fed them, allowing fear and myth to take root. He watched as the school became haunted, not by ghosts, but by his legacy. He could taste the edge of godlike control, and it made everything else seem trivial. When he graduated with top honors, praised and admired, he knew Hogwarts had not simply taught him magic. It had given him tools, sharpened his instincts, and hardened his resolve. It had fed the shadow in his soul that now yearned for more than halls and books. It craved dominion over life itself. After leaving Hogwarts, Tom Marvolo Riddle shed his mortal name like old skin and began to fashion a new identity, one not burdened by the weaknesses of the past or the expectations of others. He became Lord Voldemort, a name born of obsession with legacy and conquest, a name that would in time erase the one given to him. At birth, he did not remain in Britain for long. The world beyond offered ancient knowledge buried in forgotten temples and cursed libraries concealed in the ruins of empires lost to time. He traveled alone or with carefully selected companions drawn from those already seduced by his intelligence and charisma. He studied the languages of old carved into stone and whispered in shadows. He hunted down obscure rituals preserved only in whispers and fragments, and he tore their secrets from crumbling pages and fading memories in the forests of Albania and the deserts of Egypt, in the mountains of the Caucasus and the jungles of Southeast Asia. He found shards of dark power and hoarded them in hidden places to the few he allowed to serve him. He promised purpose, power, and purification. They were called Death Eaters. Though the name was first spoken in jest, it stuck like a brand they etched into their own flesh and sealed with blood, their loyalty enforced by oath and fear and seduction. They believed in the cause of magical dominance, the supremacy of those born into power over those who had inherited none. Voldemort fueled their faith with rhetoric and reward. But beneath it all was the truth that only his vision mattered to him, and they were merely instruments to achieve it. Central to his ambition was the rejection of mortality. He would not fade as others had not aged, nor fall to illness, nor submit to the cold embrace of time. He learned of the Horcrux, a forbidden craft so foul that few dared speak its name. To anchor a soul outside the body, one must tear it through murder, then bind the fragment to an object and seal it with dark enchantment. The first kill he made for this purpose was cold calculated, and without hesitation, it was a test of will and commitment. And when the spell was complete and the object glowed with unnatural energy, he felt not horror, but triumph. The locket of Salazar Slytherin was his first vessel. Stolen through cunning and blood, it gleamed with ancestral magic and was hidden deep within a cursed cave sealed with enchantments drawn from forgotten lore. The ring of Marvolo Gaunt was next. A family heirloom tainted by madness and pride, he slaughtered for it and encased it in hexes that would maim any who dared touch it. He ordered his loyal serpent Nagini to guard another Horcrux, to slither through graves and ruins like death itself. Each item chosen for its power, its meaning, its permanence. He believed they would shield him forever from the final sleep, but each act of creation changed him. His body began to wither, his features twisted with each piece of soul torn free. Once he had been beautiful, in a way distant and cold, but still human. Now his face grew sharper, his skin paler, until it looked more like wax than flesh. His eyes turned red, not by pigment, but by corruption. The slits of a predator. They held no warmth, no recognition, only hunger and contempt. His voice lost its warmth, becoming high and cold and piercing. A sound that silenced rooms and froze the air around it. He built his base in secret, gathering followers, torturing dissenters, seizing control of key places in the magical world with surgical precision. The ministry was not conquered overnight, but weakened from within with spies, bribes, and threats. He removed threats before they rose to open resistance. He made alliances with dark creatures, banshees, werewolves, and giants, promising them sanctuary and blood and turning their rage against his enemies. Wizarding villages were emptied, their people vanishing without a trace. Whispers of his name became a storm of terror. His symbol burned into the sky above, shattered homes, a skull with a serpent tongue, a promise of death to come. Voldemort believed himself no longer a man, but a force of nature, something ancient and elemental, to be feared, not understood. He saw love as a lie, mercy as weakness, and death as a challenge to be crushed beneath his will. With each victory, he became more reckless, more confident, certain that no force could match his genius or unravel the secrets he had bled to possess. By the time his name was feared across continents, he believed he had surpassed mortality entirely, that no prophecy or resistance could touch him. He was no longer bound to flesh or soul in the way others were. He had become legend, myth, and nightmare made real. His followers marched in his shadow, and the world trembled in silence. In 1970, a prophecy foretold that a child born at the end of July would hold the power to vanquish Voldemort, a vague promise etched into the secrecy of a seer's vision. Yet its implications ignited a storm of obsession. In the Dark Lord's mind, he scoured records, identified the potential children, and deemed the child of James and Lily Potter the likeliest threat, believing that prophecy could be killed. Before it came true, he resolved to destroy the infant. Before it could grow into a rival, he traveled in silence to Godric's Hollow on a moonless Halloween night, cloaked by enchantments and confidence. Lily Potter died protecting her son. Her scream, a thin barrier against the ancient force of death. The killing curse burst forth from Voldemort's wand, a sickly green eruption of hate. But instead of extinguishing life, it rebounded, searing through the Dark Lord's form, destroying his body and scattering his soul, torn violently from its vessel. Voldemort did not die, but he was unmade. His essence survived, clinging to existence through his Horcruxes, drifting as a formless shadow across desolate places. He wandered forests soaked in rain, ruins, silent beneath ash, and time caves where beasts whispered madness and winds carried no name. He was no ghost. He was something worse, a soul without body, a will without shape, tethered to the world by fragments of himself, locked in cursed objects, hidden with obsessive precision. The wizarding world he once ruled collapsed in the wake of his vanishing. His Death Eaters were hunted, their dark marks now meaningless. Many denied him. Others were imprisoned, and some vanished into exile without a leader. They became fractured, pitiful echoes of a once fearsome machine. Hogwarts, once steeped in fear of his name, returned slowly to peace and laughter. The Ministry of Magic breathed again, cleaning corruption from its corners, pretending that darkness had ended and that it would not return, and the name Harry Potter was spoken in awe, in hope, in myth. He became the boy who lived a child with a scar and a fate unknowable. Voldemort, meanwhile, wandered the edge of existence, his thoughts spiraling ever inward, bound by hate and humiliation, unable to fully die, yet unable to live as before. He observed from the shadows, watched time move without him, saw generations born and buried while he drifted like smoke without flame. The prophecy had not lied, but it had not been complete. It spoke of power, not intent. And Voldemort now hated that ambiguity more than he had ever hated any bloodline or rival. He remembered Godric's hollow in fragments, the flash of green, the scream of the mother, the look in the child's eyes when the curse failed. He remembered his own scream, wordless, formless, the howl of a creature robbed of dominion and control. He haunted ruins, forests, caves, any place where magic lingered in silence. He possessed vermin, fed on the blood of snakes, and whispered his name in the dark. Though no voice answered back, he was a shadow, feeding on hate, sustained by sheer will and the black pulse of his Horcruxes. He watched the world reshape itself without him. Wizards taught their children that his time had passed, that he was a warning, not a future, but he waited in the silence between dreams, in the cold between dimensions, no longer seeking mere conquest, but revenge and resurrection. Voldemort's fall was not merely the end of a tyrant, but the unraveling of a myth woven from fear and ambition. As he lingered in his cursed half-existence, drifting like a shadow through forgotten woods and across the broken stones of old strongholds, the wizarding world attempted to heal. The prophecy that had undone him was not fully understood by those who remained, but its echo lived on in whispers and in the eyes of a boy marked by lightning. For Voldemort, the absence of flesh was torment. He was no ghost, but a fragment, a will without anchor. He clung to life through enchantments he barely recalled and Horcruxes he had scattered across the world like malignant seeds. The pain of disembodiment ate at what was left of his mind. Feeding his rage, he watched from the shadows, unable to act helpless as the ministry rebuilt, and his name was stricken from records and spoken only in hushed tones. His followers either denied him or languished in prison cells waiting for a signal that never came. He no longer dreamed for dreaming, belonged to the living. He remembered Godric's hollow, the screams, the flash of green, the unbearable moment when death was returned to him. He hated the name Harry Potter, not because of the boy's power, but because of the weakness his survival revealed in Voldemort's own design. In his hunger, he haunted the dark corners of the world, the wastelands between life and death, biding time with hate. Spectral exile and shattered ambitions. For 11 long years, Voldemort existed as little more than a drifting phantom, a shred of cursed will caught between the realms of the living and the dead, suspended in a bleak, chilling void that mocked every hunger and ambition he had once cherished. His was a hollow existence, a miserable echo that wandered aimlessly through the shrouded corridors of the forbidden forest, where tangled roots clawed from the earth like the fingers of long-dead giants and ancient oaks, whispered mournful secrets in the sigh of the wind. He drifted beneath twisted boughs, heavy with moss, unseen by the creatures that scurried and hunted there, unnoticed by centaurs who rid fate in the stars above. Each night he glided to the outermost fringes of Hogwarts, the towering castle a silhouette against the silver spill of moonlight, its turrets and battlements carved sharp against the darkened sky. From the shadows, he watched lanterns flicker through frost-glazed windows, saw silhouettes of laughing students tracing carefree paths through torch-lit courtyards, and felt the pang of something like grief, or perhaps more venomous envy, twist through his formless essence. He spied on the Hogwarts bridge where young witches and wizards crossed in clusters, their voices rising in innocent chatter, oblivious to the cold specter that hovered unseen just beyond reach. In his disembodied torment, he listened to stray scraps of rumor carried by wandering owls or muttered by weary travelers at forest's edge. Tidings of Harry Potter's mundane life among the Dursleys, tales of a boy growing up under the weight of neither knowledge nor fear, of the shadow that still longed to claim him. Each trifling detail was a needle plunged deep into the raw wound of Voldemort's pride, a savage reminder of how thoroughly he had been cast down, stripped of flesh, of followers, of the intoxicating thrill of wielding dominion over trembling masses. And yet he learned much. He learned of Dumbledore's vigilant watch over the fragile boy, of the unspoken network of protections that bristled around Harry's existence like unseen thorns. He gleaned whispers of Sirius Black's haunted loyalty, of the old magic that still ran stubborn and fierce through the very stones of Hogwarts. With every passing season, the weight of impotence gnawed at him, yet in that agony was also the slow grinding of resolve, the quiet sharpening of dark intent. When at last the faint echo of opportunity stirred through the miasma of his exile, he seized it with a cold, desperate greed. Calling upon ancient bonds woven by fear and the promise of shared cruelty, he reached out to the scattered remnants of his once mighty host. Ragged men and hollow-eyed women, draped in tattered robes, still marked with the faded stain of the dark mark, crept from hiding to answer his call. They came driven by terror of retribution should they fail, or by the battered remnants of fanatic devotion that still burned in the recesses of their twisted hearts. Together, they wove a fragile conspiracy that clutched at the edges of power like skeletal hands clawing at a closed door. It was on the stony shores of a black lake, in a sagging cabin that stank of mold and old despair, that Voldemort's rebirth was at last set into grim motion. The hut stood like a rotting tooth against the still waters, its roof bowed under decades of neglect. Within, a loyal servant awaited with eyes shining fever bright, trembling as he prepared the grotesque instruments that would birth horror back into flesh. Bone of the father, stolen from a lonely grave beneath a twisted yew whose roots drank deep of ancient sorrow. Flesh of the servant, sliced away with shuddering resolve, given in pained whimpers that cracked the damp air. Blood of the enemy, taken with a cruel hiss of a blade drawn across tender skin, bright drops falling in slow, dreadful rhythm to feed the ritual's starving maw. The incantations were like knives twisting through the fabric of reality, peeling back the thin skin of the world to let the cold breath of darker planes seep through. Power surged, raw and hateful, shivering along the cracked floorboards, rattling the grimy window panes until it seemed the very hut would wrench itself apart. Amid that storm of whispered curses and unearthly light, a shape began to coil together, strands of shadow and glistening sinew knitting themselves into a ghastly whole. Slowly, horribly, a new body took form, limbs long and spider-thin, skin bleached to a ghastly pallor, veins like crawling ink beneath its fragile surface. At last, Voldemort stood once more upon the mortal stage, drawn taller and leaner than before, his eyes twin coals burning with a terrible, hungry triumph. The first breath he drew was a ragged gasp that filled his lungs with the damp rot of the lake. But it was life, pulsing and real, flooding him with sensations long denied. A cloak, dark as moonless midnight, settled close around him, returned to terror and second reign. Voldemort's return to flesh had been but the prologue to a far more dreadful chapter. For once restored, he moved with a cold and calculating fury that swept through the wizarding world like a poisoned gale. His second rise was not merely a reclamation of old power, but an evolution honed by bitterness and the memory of spectral humiliation. In shadowed chambers beneath crumbling manors, he gathered his followers anew, speaking softly of promises dark and alluring, until even those who once fled from his downfall crept back on bended knee. Whispers wound their way through the corridors of the Ministry of Magic long before his open hand fell upon it. Whispers lubricated by carefully placed bribes that glittered under candlelight and by threats murmured at midnight, which left powerful officials waking in sweat-soaked terror. Ministers who had long basked in the illusion of safety found themselves bending beneath invisible weights, signing decrees with shaking hands, as if compelled by forces they could neither name nor fight. Courts of foreign magical governments, once aloof and disdainful of British turmoil, were infiltrated by envoys cloaked in charming facades who sowed subtle lies like rot among ripe fruit. In gilded halls from Paris to Prague, conspiracies blossomed, setting nations against one another, so that when Voldemort chose to tighten his grip, there was no chorus of protest, only a brittle, fearful silence. It was in a single cruel night that he truly announced his dominion, descending upon Hogsmeade with a retinue of masked figures whose laughter split the village streets like knives. Homes burst into hungry flames, timber groaned and collapsed into beds of glowing embers, and overhead the dark mark spread its serpent coils across the heavens, a grim herald that peace had ended. When autumn's first leaf fell upon the grounds of Hogwarts, it landed not upon tranquil soil, but upon stones still warm from spilled blood, for even that ancient fortress could not wholly bar out the storm. Within its hidden passages, Dumbledore's army gathered once more, their breath misting in the chill air as wands were gripped tighter, eyes bright with stubborn hope. They practiced spells whispered from old books, incantations shared in huddled circles, each charm a fragile ember defying the suffocating dark. Outside the castle, propaganda slithered through streets and alleys, carried on enchanted pamphlets that blossomed in black script proclaiming Harry Potter a liar, a boy bought by Voldemort's own hand, a traitor to the very people he claimed to defend. Windows bore posters that showed Harry with hollow eyes, twisted into sneers of cruelty he had never worn. For the common wizard, each morning dawned beneath a shroud of suspicion, each evening closed upon doorways barred tight against unseen horrors. Families sat at hearths whose flames seemed dimmer than in years before, clinging to old stories of safety that now sounded thin and unconvincing. In this reign of terror, Voldemort exulted, striding through torchlit halls where his followers knelt in rows to kiss the hem of his cloak. He believed he had finally rewritten reality itself, that fear was now the very air all must breathe, that history would forever mark these days as the birth of a new order shaped by his ruthless hand. Yet, in his soaring arrogance, he failed to see the threads of defiance that wove themselves quietly through the tapestry of his empire. For every scream torn from a trembling throat, every desperate plea that echoed down stone corridors, there was also a small flame kindled in hearts uncounted. Mothers whispered courage to wide-eyed children beneath bed covers. Old wizards pressed rusted wands into younger palms with trembling insistence that hope must be kept alive. In dim rooms above shuttered shops, witches brewed potions meant not for profit, but for healing wounded fighters who would never pay in coin. At the heart of it stood Harry Potter, unbroken by the slander that painted him a puppet of the Dark Lord. His eyes held a bright, pained certainty, forged in the crucible of grief and hardened by the countless small loyalties that gathered around him. Where Voldemort sowed terror, Harry and those who loved him sowed quiet defiance, planting stubborn roots that clung even to the coldest stones. And so each triumph Voldemort claimed became subtly undermined. Each decree he forced through trembling ministers' lips was met somewhere by a whispered refusal, a hidden sigil chalked upon an alley wall, a covert wand raised in defiance. He had imagined he could snuff out resistance by crushing the spirit of the people, but discovered too late that the human heart is a strange thing, capable of treasuring love all the more fiercely when threatened by hate. The reign he thought would be eternal began to twist upon itself, shadowed by rumors of uprisings in distant hamlets, by sightings of the boy who lived walking openly, where the final duel and last fall. The final reckoning came not with the roar of triumphant fanfare, nor under banners proudly raised, but in the bitter heart of winter, as snow drifted soft and cold across the ravaged courtyards of Hogwarts. Walls once noble and proud were fractured by war, their stones scored by curses that had danced like hungry spirits, leaving gaping wounds through which the wind howled mournfully. Among shattered columns and splintered doors, students and professors stood side by side, their faces pale with exhaustion, yet set in grim, unyielding resolve. Robes torn, wands clutched in raw-knuckled grips, they formed a ragged line against the tide of Death Eaters whose dark cloaks billowed like carrion wings. The air between them shivered with unleashed magic, spells whirring past like startled fireflies, burning streaks of red and silver that met in mid-air and blossomed into bursts of cruel light. Statues of long-dead founders cracked their stone jaws wide to bellow defiance, lumbering forward with ponderous might to sweep clawed hands through ranks of snarling foes. Shields of luminescent gold and trembling sapphire rose and fell, splintering under repeated assault, yet always someone else stepped forward to raise another, born of sheer desperate hope. Above it all, the battered flags of Hogwarts still clung stubbornly to shattered poles, torn ribbons that fluttered weakly but refused to fall. Amid this chaos, where screams tangled with thunder and the very earth seemed to flinch under repeated blows, Harry Potter pressed through broken archways until he stood upon icy flagstones stained with the dark spatters of battle. Before him loomed Voldemort, draped in a cloak so black it seemed to drink the faint winter light, his features twisted into a cold mask that betrayed neither fatigue nor fear. They faced each other beneath the tattered remnants of a Slytherin banner that hung in defeated folds, a mockery of triumph that swayed gently as though it too held its breath. In that fragile hush between heartbeats, the world seemed to narrow to just the two of them, predator and prey circling across frost-dusted stone. Voldemort's voice sliced the air, sharp and imperious, a final command that summoned forth murder with the ease of drawing breath. Green light exploded from his wand, a curse saturated with years of hate and certainty. But Harry lifted his own wand, not with venom, nor with the raw hunger for vengeance that might have mirrored his enemy, but with a quiet, sorrowful power, born of all he had lost and chosen still to love. His spell was softer, almost tender in its shimmering glow, and for a single impossible instant it wrapped around Voldemort's killing curse like a gentle hand closing over a dagger's hilt. Then the world erupted in brilliance. The Dark Lord's own curse twisted upon itself, shrieking through the void as though shocked by betrayal, and with a final shattering roar, it struck back toward the one who had birthed it. A violent flash of emerald fire consumed Voldemort, searing across his narrow chest and clawing through the stolen threads of immortality he had so jealously guarded. His scream cracked the frozen air, a sound of pure disbelief more than agony, and then his body crumpled to the icy ground. There it lay for a single trembling heartbeat before it began to dissolve, flesh sinking inward as if devoured by an invisible tide, cloak sagging around hollow bones that turned brittle and fractured into dust. The last Horcrux, hidden deep within the labyrinth of his soul, splintered under the force of that reflected curse, breaking apart with a soundless finality that echoed far beyond mortal ears. Freed from its unnatural bonds, Voldemort's essence shuddered once in the cold air, a faint coil of darkness that writhed weakly before unraveling into nothingness. Above the courtyard, the sky, long bruised by storm and war, began to lighten. Dawn crept slowly over the jagged horizon, spilling gentle gold across snowbanks dotted with fallen wands and discarded masks. The light touched the remnants of Hogwarts with delicate fingers, finding beauty even in ruin, coaxing tears from the weary who lifted their eyes to watch as the first true peace in so many years unfolded overhead. Around Harry, the defenders of the castle stood stunned, breaths ghosting in the frosty air, wands lowered at last. Some dropped to their knees, overcome by relief that sapped their strength more thoroughly than any spell. In those still moments, as the final whisper of Voldemort's malice dispersed on the breeze, it was as though the world itself drew a deep, cleansing breath. The cold that remained was only winter's honest chill, no longer sharpened by the edge of terror. And Harry, standing there with his wand slack at his side, felt the immense, echoing emptiness left by victory. The war was over, but its scars would remain written across the stones of Hogwarts and upon every heart that had braved the dark. The silence that followed Voldemort's fall did not come all at once. It unfolded slowly, like fog receding after a storm, revealing the broken terrain beneath. The wizarding world stood still, holding its breath, caught in that fragile space between grief and relief. His reign had collapsed, but the cost was written in ash, blood, and memory. Diagon Alley, once vibrant with color and laughter, bore the marks of battle: burned signs, shattered glass, scorched walls. Yet it was there that candles were first lit. Quiet vigils turned into public remembrance. Statues were raised not only for the famous, but for the unseen. The messenger who never made it back, the mother who sheltered Muggle-born children, the centaur who stood guard at the forest's edge. In Hogsmeade, a memorial garden grew out of the frost. Flowers enchanted to never wilt circled stones etched with names, each one a life taken by darkness. The names weren't arranged by bloodline or allegiance, but by the moment they fell, side by side, regardless of origin. It was a decision made deliberately. No more walls, no more divisions. The pain was shared now. At the Ministry of Magic, justice did not come with banners or parades. It came with silence, with heavy doors opening to testimonies, and with a sobering truth. Not all evil had worn black robes. Collaborators were named not to stir vengeance, but to prevent forgetfulness. Courtrooms became spaces of reckoning. The wizarding world faced itself, not just what it had endured, but what it had allowed. Dolores Umbridge sat coldly in the witness chair, stripped of her smugness, her pink cardigans no longer a shield. Others, lesser known, wept as they spoke, some out of guilt, others out of fear. In those rooms, the price of silence became undeniable. At Hogwarts, healing began in the corridors long haunted by war. The castle bore wounds, blasted stone, burned portraits, vanished staircases, but it stood. Students returned, many older than their years, all carrying scars. Classrooms were quiet, thoughtful, transformed. Defense against the dark arts was no longer just a subject. It was a philosophy, a commitment. Each spell learned was a stand against tyranny. Every lesson a whisper, never again. Professors rewrote syllabi. History of magic was no longer a monotone lecture, but a deep study in how darkness rises and how indifference lets it thrive. In those classrooms, Tom Riddle's name was not avoided. It was examined. The boy who once walked those same halls had been clever, charming, hungry. His fall into Voldemort was mapped not just as a cautionary tale, but as a mirror. Students were taught to see it, to understand how fear, rejection, and unchecked ambition could warp even the brightest mind. They didn't fear his name anymore. They feared the path he took and vowed not to follow it. Outside the school, change pressed forward. The ministry restructured laws with urgency and humility. Magical creatures long marginalized were invited to the table, literally. Goblins received legislative rights. House elves were given freedom and wages, with entire wings of the ministry devoted to interspecies justice. Even centaurs, historically distrustful, agreed to participate in the post-war accords. A new department, the Intermagical Reconciliation Bureau, emerged as a symbol of a more inclusive future. It was not without resistance. Change never is. But the direction was clear. And through all this, the Phoenix returned. The Order's sigil, long worn in secret, now burned proudly on walls and flags. In wizarding homes, phoenixes were sketched onto windows, etched into door frames, embroidered into robes. They stood not as a reminder of war, but of resilience. In hospitals, survivors wore phoenix pins as quiet signals of strength. At sunrise, across villages and cities, the magical and non-magical alike looked to the horizon and remembered those who had chosen light even when the world was drowning in shadow. The scars were still there, some physical, others invisible, lingering behind the eyes and in dreams that refused to fade. But in those scars, the wizarding world found identity, a shared narrative born not of victory, but of endurance. They did not celebrate the end of Voldemort as a triumph, but as a warning. Evil had not vanished. It had only been beaten back. Its return would always be possible, but so would their resistance. And in every whispered story, every classroom, every flicker of wand light lit with care and courage, there was one enduring truth, that love, chosen freely and fiercely, remained the strongest magic of all. Harry Potter never sought glory, even in the days following the war, when crowds cheered his name and newspapers hailed him as the boy who conquered. He moved through the world quietly, uncomfortably aware that his survival had come at great cost. While others rebuilt homes, he rebuilt his sense of purpose. He did not retire to a peaceful life, though it was offered. He chose instead to step into the heart of what he had fought to protect. As an aura, he dedicated himself to rooting out the last traces of dark magic. It was not the grand battles that defined this new chapter of his life, but the subtle, persistent work, tracking cursed artifacts, dismantling hidden cults, and above all, protecting those who could not protect themselves. The ministry was different now, tempered by pain and reformed by conscience, and under Harry's quiet influence, it grew wiser. In time, he rose to lead magical law enforcement, not through ambition, but by trust earned. His colleagues knew he would never ask them to do anything he wouldn't do himself. His office was unadorned, its shelves filled not with awards but with case files, journals, and photographs of those who had fought beside him and those who had fallen. Yet it was not all war and watchfulness. Harry found joy again, slowly and then fully, in the arms of Ginny Weasley. Their love had survived the fire and now grew in the gentle warmth of peace. They married in a modest ceremony under the open sky, surrounded by friends who knew too well the value of such a day. Together, they built a home, not just a house. It echoed with laughter and broomsticks crashing into furniture, with kitchen chaos and quiet talks under stars. They had 3 children, James Sirius, Albus Severus, and Lily Luna, each named not just in tribute, but in hope. These names were not weights, but gifts, stories carried forward, threads woven into the next generation. Harry did not shield his children from the past. He told them the truth, age-appropriate, carefully shaped, but honest. He spoke of bravery and sacrifice, of mistakes made and lessons learned. He told them about his mother Lily, who had died for him without hesitation, and about Snape, whose love had outlived hatred. He told them about Sirius, who taught him family is chosen, and about Dumbledore, whose wisdom was sometimes flawed but always vast. These tales were not lectures, but moments shared by the fireplace, voices low, flames dancing in Ginny's eyes as she listened too, memories flickering just out of reach. Each night ended the same way, with a reminder that the greatest magic was not in spells or wands, but in kindness, in choosing to help when it would be easier to walk away, in forgiving even when the pain still lingered. And yet, even in peace, Harry remained vigilant. He had seen too much to believe that evil vanished entirely. In shadowed alleys and forgotten corners, he heard whispers, tales traded in dying taverns about hidden grimoires, cursed rings, or diaries that pulsed with a strange, cold heartbeat. Most were stories, echoes, desperate fantasies clung to by those who had lost their power. But some were real. A child found speaking Parseltongue in a school far from Britain, a mirror that showed not reflections, but a younger, crueler man. A wand buried in a field, humming with rage. Voldemort's name had become taboo again, not out of fear, but out of discomfort. The world wanted to move on, to forget the ache. But forgetting, Harry knew, was dangerous. So he did not forget. He remembered every face, every cry, every cold night in the Forbidden Forest. He remembered what it felt like to stand alone and what it meant to be saved by friendship. He remembered how easily the line between courage and cruelty could blur. And because he remembered, he watched, not with paranoia, but with resolve. He trained new auras to think, not just to fight. He taught them that power meant responsibility, and that real strength lay in restraint. He walked among the wounded, listened to their stories, made space for their grief. He kept his wand not as a weapon, but as a promise. His scar, though faded, sometimes itched in the quiet hours, not from dark magic, but from the weight of memory. Harry carried it with grace. It was part of his story, but not the end of it. In his children, he saw the future unburdened. In Ginny, he saw the anchor that held him steady. And in every act of kindness he witnessed, in a student helping another with a spell, in a stranger offering a seat on the night bus, in a letter from a child who had read about his life and wanted to grow up brave, he saw proof that the light had not dimmed. It had simply passed to new hands. And though Voldemort's shadow might someday stir again, Harry Potter would be ready. Not with fear, but with love, with memory, and with the enduring knowledge that even in the darkest hour, there would always be those who choose to stand in the light. Generations passed, but the story of Lord Voldemort endured, woven now into both myth and memory, retold in classrooms and whispered in corridors, its edges softened by time, but its core never forgotten. The name Tom Riddle rarely appeared in textbooks without warning, not because it stirred fear, but because it demanded reflection. The tale had become more than history. It had become a parable, a mirror, in which every young witch and wizard might glimpse both the peril of unchecked power and the possibility of redemption through choice. At Hogwarts, the Forbidden Forest, once a place of terror and secrecy, became a destination for learning and courage. Graduate students entered it not with trembling, but with reverence, tasked with mapping its tangled roots and hidden glades. Somewhere in its depths, beneath ancient boughs and moss-choked stone, lay relics of an old war. Pieces of robes long turned to dust, a silver locket sealed in enchanted crystal, and the faint, lingering echo of a scream never quite claimed by time. Each discovery was recorded, studied, and locked away behind wards so strong no hand could disturb them. Iron doors protected by spells of remembrance, not fear. Beyond the forest, tombs stood silently beneath earth and ivy, never marked openly, but known to those sworn to guard the boundaries between curiosity and danger. These were the places where Horcruxes had been shattered, where darkness had tried to cheat death and had been dragged down by its own arrogance. Magical historians, in flowing robes of midnight blue, wandered these quiet places like monks, etching the story into scrolls and enchanted ink, not as glorification, but as warning. They did not seek to forget what had happened. They sought to remember so well that forgetting would become impossible. And yet, even in the darkest of those records, beside every account of cruelty and loss, a brighter truth was always etched, that for every curse cast, there was a shield raised, for every betrayal, a loyalty unbroken, for every soul lost, a light kindled in their name. The wings of the phoenix flared across pages and across generations, a flame that refused to die. Sometimes, on a quiet evening in the castle, long after curfew and with the torches flickering low, students would swear they heard a whisper in the portrait gallery, a sigh from a frame whose occupant had long since faded, or the hoot of an owl cutting across the night sky, almost shaping a name that once froze the blood. These echoes were not feared. They were part of the world now, lingering reminders that peace was never given. It was kept, guarded by vigilance and choice. But far more than these echoes, the greater legacy was one of hope. In every young wizard or witch stepping onto the train at platform 9 3/4, eyes wide and hearts racing, there was a quiet inheritance carried unknowingly, a world where freedom had been won, rebuilt, and cherished. Laughter filled the corridors once scorched by war. Portraits smiled in frames that had once borne silent witness to pain. Books, once hidden out of fear, now sat openly on shelves, their dark pages surrounded by thousands more filled with light. Peace had not erased the past. It had honored it, and in doing so, it had made space for joy again. Parents told their children the story not to frighten them, but to show them what had been overcome. That a boy with a lightning-shaped scar had once faced the embodiment of hatred and chosen mercy. That friends who had no reason to stay had stood their ground anyway. That love, quiet, unyielding, and ordinary, had been the one force that even death could not master. And so, as night fell over the high towers of Hogwarts, and the stars shimmered over the Black Lake, young students drifted to sleep with no thought of war. In their dreams, they walked alongside heroes, not in battle, but in gardens, on broomsticks, under banners of peace. They dreamed not of curses, but of creation. And in those dreams, beneath the surface, a truth lived, quiet, eternal, unshakable, that no darkness, however ancient or vast, could endure against the steady, unwavering light of compassion. It did not take a spell to cast it. No wand was needed, only a choice, made again and again, in the face of fear, in the presence of pain. A choice to believe in others, a choice to love. And so the story ended not with a final battle or closed book, but with a promise carried forward, a promise that the light would never go out, not so long as even one heart remained brave enough to pass it on.